Missouri River Territory, 1843. While every trader and settler raced to stack logs before the first snow, one weathered trapper was still digging. His neighbors called it madness. They called him a prairie mole. He was building down, not up, excavating a circular pit, then erecting timber posts in a dome shape. Over the wooden frame went thick mats of willow and brush, then layers upon layers of prairie sod, until 3 feet of packed earth covered everything like a giant burial mound. The other settlers finished their cabins in 3 weeks with axe and saw. He spent 2 months burying his home underground. Then December arrived. Howling winds off the plains, temperatures plunging to 20 below zero. The blizzards came in waves, each one worse than the last. Standard log cabins leaked cold through every chink and gap. Families burned through cords of firewood just to survive each night. But inside that buried dome, 55 degrees without any fire at all, the earth itself holding warmth like a massive stone. What did he understand about thermal mass and underground shelter that everyone else dismissed as primitive foolishness? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. The trading post at Bent Creek sat where the Missouri curved through buffalo country, a collection of rough-hewn buildings that served trappers, traders, and the handful of settlers pushing west ahead of the main migration. Cottonwoods lined the riverbank, their trunks scarred by axe marks where men had taken what they needed for shelter. The Hidatsa had camped these bottoms for generations before the white men arrived, and their earth lodges still dotted the bluffs upstream, low, grass-covered mounds that most newcomers mistook for natural hills until they noticed the smoke rising from their centers. Thomas Beaumont had spent 3 winters among the Hidatsa during his trapping days, learning their language and their ways when beaver pelts still commanded good prices in St. Louis. The earth lodge had fascinated him from his first night inside one, how the thick earthen walls held warmth through the coldest months, how the dome shape shed wind like water off a duck's back, how a small fire could heat the entire space while log cabins required roaring blazes that consumed cord after cord of precious wood. When his trapping partner froze to death in a hastily built lean-to during the winter of 1839, Beaumont knew he would never again trust his life to conventional frontier shelter. By 1843, he had saved enough from his fur trade earnings to claim land near Bent Creek and build proper. But his idea of proper differed sharply from his neighbors. While Samuel Henderson and the Morrison brothers raced to fell trees and notch logs before the leaves turned, Beaumont spent his days walking the prairie with Iron Bull, an aging Hidatsa builder who had agreed to guide him through the old methods. They selected a spot on a gentle rise, protected from the worst winds but with good drainage. Iron Bull showed him how to read the earth, testing with his knife point for the clay layer that would shed water, judging the slope to prevent pooling, marking where the morning sun would strike the entrance. The digging began in late August. Beaumont carved a circular pit 18 feet across and 3 feet deep, piling the excavated earth in neat mounds nearby. His neighbors stopped their own work to watch and shake their heads. Henderson called across the distance between their claims, "You building a root cellar or a house, Beaumont?" The Morrison boys were less diplomatic. "Looks like he's digging his own grave," young Pete Morrison announced loud enough for half the settlement to hear. The laughter that followed carried across the prairie grass. But Beaumont had learned patience from Iron Bull, who worked with the deliberate care of a man whose life had depended on getting details right. They sank 4 massive cottonwood posts in the center of the pit, each trunk a foot thick and buried deep enough to bear the weight of earth and snow. Around the perimeter, they placed 16 more posts, creating a circle that would support the dome's outer edge. The rafters came next, long poles radiating from the central post to the outer ring like the ribs of an overturned basket. Iron Bull insisted on lashing each joint with rawhide soaked in water, knowing it would shrink tight as it dried and hold firm through years of freeze and thaw. Henderson and the Morrisons had their cabins chinked and roofed by mid-September. They stood in their doorways watching Beaumont weave willow branches between his rafters, creating a tight mat that would hold the earth layers. "Man's building himself a beaver lodge," Henderson called to his wife. "Next he'll be growing a flat tail." Even Father McKenna, who rode circuit between the scattered settlements, paused to study the strange construction. "Looks heathen to me," he pronounced, though he said it kindly enough. "Good Christian folk build up toward heaven, not down into the ground like moles." The criticism stung, but Beaumont had seen what happened to good Christian folk when their flimsy shelters failed them. He pressed on, layering prairie sod over the willow mat in overlapping courses like a stonemason building a wall. Each piece had to be cut precisely, 18 inches long, 12 inches wide, 4 inches thick, and laid grass side down so the root systems would knit together and hold. Iron Bull taught him to save the best sod for last, the pieces with the deepest roots and tightest weave. These would form the outer shell that had to shed rain and hold against wind. October brought the first hard frost, and still Beaumont worked. He built up the earthen dome layer by layer, tamping each course solid before adding the next. The entrance took special care, a covered passage angled to block wind with stone steps leading down to the main floor. Above ground, the structure rose only 6 feet at its highest point, a gentle mound that would disappear under snow and grass. From a distance, it looked like nothing more than a natural hill. The smoke hole at the apex required the most precision. Too large and heat would escape, too small and smoke would choke the inhabitants. Iron Bull showed him how to line it with flat stones, creating a chimney that would draw properly while shedding rain. The final touch was a wooden cover that could be adjusted with poles from inside, controlling the draft like a damper in a stovepipe. By late October, when the cottonwood leaves had turned yellow and begun to fall, Beaumont's strange home was complete. The other settlers had been warm in their cabins for weeks, their evening fires sending orange light through oiled paper windows. Beaumont's mound showed only a thin trail of smoke rising from what looked like empty prairie. Henderson stopped by on his way back from checking his trap lines. "Still time to build a proper cabin," he offered, not unkindly. "That thing might cave in come spring thaw." Beaumont thanked him for the concern, but felt no need to explain what he had learned from men who had survived 1,000 winters in country that killed the unprepared. The first snow was still weeks away, but already the wind carried the bite of the season to come. Inside his earth lodge, banked coals glowed in the central fire pit, their heat beginning to warm the thick walls that would hold and return that warmth through the longest nights. The question that hung over Bent Creek as autumn deepened was simple enough. When the real cold came, would the man who built like a mole prove to be the wisest of them all? November arrived with a vengeance that old-timers would remember for decades. The first blizzard struck on the 7th, 3 days of howling wind that drove snow horizontal across the prairie and piled drifts against every vertical surface. Temperatures plummeted to 15 below zero, then kept falling. By the 10th, the mercury in Henderson's thermometer had retreated so far into the bulb that he could no longer read the markings. Inside Henderson's cabin, the family huddled around a fire that consumed split oak faster than he could feed it. The logs were well chinked with mud and moss, but wind found every imperfection, every slight gap where wood had shrunk or settling had opened cracks. Cold seeped through the walls themselves, the single thickness of 8-inch logs providing scant barrier against the relentless chill. Mary Henderson wrapped her children in buffalo robes and still their breath frosted in the air 6 feet from the hearth. The cabin's single room required constant tending of the fire, and even then, the temperature never climbed above 40 degrees. Henderson calculated grimly that his winter's supply of firewood was disappearing at twice the rate he had planned. The Morrison boys fared no better in their hastily built shelter. Their cabin leaked wind through gaps they had never noticed during construction, and the corner fireplace, built against the outer wall in the conventional manner, seemed to suck heat straight up the chimney and out into the night. Pete Morrison spent his days splitting wood with numb fingers, feeding logs into a fire that barely warmed the space beyond arm's reach. Their single window, covered with oiled paper, rattled constantly in its frame, and frost formed on the inside walls despite the blazing hearth. Across the settlement, other families faced similar struggles. The Kellys lost their weakest calf when their makeshift barn proved inadequate against the penetrating cold. Old Lars Jorgensen, who had survived Minnesota winters, admitted privately to his wife that this Missouri country seemed to cut deeper into a man's bones than anything he had known. Every cabin became a fortress under siege, with families burning furniture when cut wood ran low and melting snow for water because the well pumps had frozen solid. But from Beaumont's earth lodge, only the thinnest wisp of smoke rose through the night. Inside the buried dome, a different reality prevailed. The massive earthen walls, 3 feet thick in places, absorbed the day's meager warmth and released it slowly through the darkness. The dome shape shed the howling wind like a stone in a creek, offering no flat surfaces for the air to grab and shake. Snow accumulated on the curved roof, adding another layer of insulation that made the structure even more effective. The central fire pit required only a handful of split wood each evening. Beaumont would light kindling around sunset, let the flames build for an hour to warm the air and heat the earth walls, then bank the coals and let the thermal mass do its work. The stone-lined smoke hole drew perfectly, pulling smoke up and out while the heated air circulated naturally through the space. By morning, when Henderson was splitting frozen logs with aching hands, Beaumont's lodge maintained a steady 55 degrees with nothing more than glowing embers. The difference became impossible to ignore as the cold snap stretched into its second week. Henderson's wife began timing her cooking to maximize the heat from their stove, while Beaumont could work comfortably in his underground chamber wearing nothing heavier than a wool shirt. The Morrison boys burned through their winter wood supply so fast they began eyeing the logs of their own cabin walls, while Beaumont's modest pile of split cottonwood seemed hardly diminished. Word of the disparity spread through the settlement in the way that survival information travels among isolated people. Father McKenna, making his rounds despite the bitter weather, stopped at each cabin to check on families and found them huddled around fires, rationing warmth like a precious commodity. When he climbed the low hill to Beaumont's place, expecting to find another struggle against the elements, he discovered something that challenged his understanding of proper Christian architecture. The entrance passage, angled to block wind, led down into a space that felt like a different season. Beaumont sat comfortably at a small table, mending harness by the light of a single candle. The air was warm enough that the priest loosened his heavy coat within minutes of entering. No drafts stirred the flame. No frost formed on the earthen walls. No desperate scramble for fuel marked the evening routine. The priest accepted coffee that had been kept warm on the small fire and tried to reconcile what he saw with what he had been taught about civilized shelter. Henderson made his own visit 3 days later, when his family's shivering had become desperate enough to overcome his pride. He found Beaumont splitting kindling in the protected entrance, working without gloves in air that felt positively balmy compared to the brutal wind outside. Inside the lodge, Henderson's children stopped their constant shivering for the first time in a week. His wife Mary stood close to the small fire and marveled that such a modest flame could warm such a large space. The measurements Henderson took that night would haunt his memory through many winters to come. Outside temperature, 28 below zero. Inside his own cabin, with a roaring fire, 38 degrees. Inside Beaumont's earth lodge, with barely glowing coals, 54 degrees. The difference represented not just comfort, but survival itself. As December deepened and the cold showed no sign of breaking, the settlement faced a harsh reckoning. Conventional wisdom demanded large fires, thick walls of stacked logs, and constant labor to maintain barely adequate warmth. But buried in the prairie like some ancient secret, Beaumont's strange home defied every assumption about shelter and survival. The question no longer concerned the wisdom of building underground, it concerned how much longer the conventional approach could sustain families whose wood supplies dwindled with each passing day. The blizzard that struck on December 18th made the earlier storms seem like gentle snow showers. Wind gusts reached 60 miles per hour, driving ice crystals with such force that they cut exposed skin like tiny knives. The temperature dropped to 35 below zero and stayed there for 6 straight days, a cold so severe that spit froze before it hit the ground and metal tools became too dangerous to handle with bare skin. Henderson's cabin, which had seemed sturdy enough during construction, began to show fatal flaws under the sustained assault. The wind found purchase against the flat walls and shook the entire structure with each gust. Chinking between the logs, adequate for ordinary winter weather, proved worthless against the penetrating cold. Gaps that had been invisible in autumn now leaked frigid, air that no amount of fire could overcome. The single-walled construction, 8 inches of oak that had seemed substantial in September, conducted cold through the wood itself until frost formed on the interior surface, despite a fire that consumed 2 cords of split logs in as many days. Worse still, the conventional fireplace design that placed the hearth against the outer wall created a thermal disaster. Heat rose straight up the chimney and escaped to the outside, while cold air was drawn down the flue and into the living space. The Morrison boys discovered this deadly flaw when their fire began smoking so badly they could barely breathe. Pete Morrison climbed onto the roof in the howling wind, trying to clear ice from the chimney, and nearly lost 3 fingers to frostbite before his brother dragged him back inside. Carbon monoxide poisoning began claiming victims as families sealed every gap they could find and burned green wood in desperation. The Kelly family woke one morning to find their youngest son unconscious, his skin an alarming blue-gray color. Only Mary Kelly's quick thinking, dragging the child outside into the bitter air, saved his life. But the incident forced them to choose between suffocation and freezing, and they chose to shiver rather than risk poisoning their children. The wind proved as deadly as the cold. Gusts strong enough to lift a grown man off his feet battered the rectangular cabins from every direction, finding weak points in construction and exploiting them mercilessly. The Jorgensen cabin lost half its roof when the wind caught the edge of a poorly secured board and peeled back the entire section like paper. Snow poured through the gap, and the family huddled in one corner, while Lars tried to patch the hole with buffalo hides that froze solid before he could secure them properly. Food preservation became another crisis as cabin temperatures fluctuated wildly. The Henderson family watched their winter supply of salt pork spoil when the meat alternately froze and thawed near their inconsistent fire. Vegetables stored in root cellars beneath the cabins froze solid when the cold penetrated through floorboards that conducted thermal energy like metal. Water barrels split when ice expanded faster than the wood could accommodate, leaving families to melt snow over fires that already demanded constant feeding. Medical emergencies multiplied as the cold took its toll on human bodies stressed beyond their limits. Henderson developed a persistent cough that produced blood-flecked sputum, the result of breathing superheated air near the fire followed by frigid drafts from gaps in the walls. His wife Mary suffered chilblains on her feet from the constant cycle of warming by the fire and cooling when she moved to tend the children. Young Pete Morrison lost feeling in 2 toes, the beginning stages of frostbite that would leave him partially crippled for the rest of his life. But inside Beaumont's Earth Lodge, a different reality persisted with almost supernatural consistency. The dome shape continued to shed wind like a natural hill, offering no surface for the storm to grab and shake. The 3-foot-thick earthen walls, their thermal mass equivalent to a massive stone, absorbed the small amounts of heat from the central fire and radiated it back through the night. Snow accumulated on the curved roof to a depth of 4 feet, creating an additional layer of insulation that made the structure even more efficient. The controlled environment inside the lodge maintained itself with minimal intervention. Beaumont burned perhaps 6 pieces of split wood each day, less than Henderson used in 2 hours, and the temperature never dropped below 52 degrees. The stone-lined smoke hole continued to draw perfectly, venting combustion gases while maintaining the slight positive pressure that prevented cold air infiltration. Even when the fire died completely during the night, the thermal mass of the earthen walls continued radiating stored heat until morning. Food storage inside the lodge remained stable and predictable. Root vegetables kept in cache pits dug into the floor stayed fresh and never froze. Salt pork hung from the rafters aged properly in the consistent cool temperature rather than spoiling from temperature fluctuations. Water stored in clay vessels near the fire pit stayed liquid without boiling, providing a steady supply for cooking and washing that required no daily struggle with frozen containers. Beaumont himself showed no signs of the stress that was breaking down his neighbors. His breathing remained clear and easy in the properly ventilated space. His skin stayed healthy without the constant cycle of burning heat and freezing cold that plagued cabin dwellers. He slept through the night without waking to feed fires, and his food supplies remained virtually untouched while others faced the prospect of starvation before spring. By Christmas Eve, the contrast had become undeniable to anyone willing to acknowledge it. Henderson's family had burned through 80% of their winter wood supply in 3 weeks, while Beaumont's modest pile showed barely a dent. The Morrison boys had used furniture, fence posts, and even floorboards to keep their fire going, while Beaumont split kindling with the leisurely care of a man whose survival was never in question. 3 families had members showing signs of serious cold-related illness, while the Earth Lodge occupant remained as healthy as he had been in autumn. The final breaking point came during the night of December 24th, when the Jorgensen cabin filled with smoke so thick that the family could not breathe. They stumbled out into the killing wind with nothing but the clothes on their backs, facing a choice between suffocation and freezing. Through the howling darkness, they could see a thin trail of smoke rising from Beaumont's mound, evidence of warmth and safety that seemed as distant as salvation itself. Lars Jorgensen stumbled through the waist-deep snow toward the barely visible mound, his wife clutching their 2 children against the wind that cut through their clothes like a blade. Behind them, their cabin continued to fill with toxic smoke from the blocked chimney, making return impossible. The old Norwegian had swallowed his pride many times in 63 years, but never had humility felt so much like a matter of life and death. His knuckles, already numb from the cold, rapped against the wooden door set into the earth embankment. Beaumont opened the entrance without hesitation or questions. The angled passage that had seemed unnecessarily complex during construction now revealed its purpose. Warm air from the lodge stayed inside while the family hurried through the windbreak toward safety. Within 30 seconds of stepping into the main chamber, Jorgensen felt the temperature difference like a physical embrace. His youngest daughter stopped crying for the first time in hours, and his wife's violent shivering began to subside as blood returned to her extremities. The Earth Lodge, designed for a single occupant or small family, suddenly housed 6 people. But the thermal mass that had maintained consistent temperature with one resident adapted easily to the additional body heat. If anything, the space grew slightly warmer as human presence supplemented the small fire that glowed in the central pit. Jorgensen marveled at how the earthen walls absorbed excess heat and humidity without creating the condensation problems that plagued overcrowded cabins. Word of the Jorgensen rescue spread through the settlement by morning, carried by desperate people checking on their neighbors. Henderson arrived at midday, his pride finally broken by the sight of his wife coughing blood and his youngest son's lips turning blue, despite a fire that consumed their remaining furniture. The Morrisons followed that evening, Pete's frost-bitten toes making every step an agony that overrode his stubborn independence. Father McKenna brought the Kellys after their second bout with carbon monoxide poisoning nearly killed their baby. By New Year's Eve, 19 people crowded into a space originally intended for 3. The Earth Lodge stretched its capacity but never broke. Buffalo robes and woolen blankets covered every inch of floor space, and bodies pressed together for warmth in a way that would have been intolerable in a drafty cabin but felt natural in the consistently heated environment. The air remained breathable because the stone-lined smoke hole continued to function perfectly, drawing combustion gases up and out while maintaining the slight positive pressure that prevented backdraft. The social dynamics of the overcrowded shelter proved as remarkable as its thermal performance. Henderson, who had led the mockery of Beaumont's construction methods, now found himself studying every detail of the lodge's interior. He traced the lashing patterns that held the dome framework together, noting how rawhide bindings had shrunk tight and held firm through months of temperature variation. He examined the stonework around the smoke hole, understanding for the first time how the carefully fitted rocks created a chimney that drew without losing heat. Mary Henderson began sketching the cache pits that kept vegetables fresh in the floor's hard-packed earth. She measured the depth, 3 feet, and noted how clay vessels fit precisely into holes lined with flat stones. The storage system maintained a constant temperature just above freezing, perfect for root vegetables that had spoiled in the fluctuating conditions of her cabin's root cellar. She watched Beaumont retrieve turnips and potatoes that were as fresh as the day they had been stored, while her own winter supplies had alternately frozen and thawed until they became inedible mush. Pete Morrison, his bandaged toes a constant reminder of conventional shelters' failures, spent his days memorizing the construction techniques he had ridiculed months earlier. He counted rafters, 32 poles radiating from the central post to the outer ring, and estimated their spacing at 18-inch intervals. He noted how each layer of sod overlapped the one below, creating a weatherproof shell that grew stronger as the grass roots knitted together. The willow mat beneath the earth layers fascinated him most, woven tight enough to hold soil, but loose enough to allow air circulation that prevented rot. Young Jim Morrison appointed himself the lodge's unofficial chronicler, marking temperatures on a piece of bark with charcoal each morning and evening. Outside temperature, consistently 20 to 35 below zero. Inside temperature, never below 52 degrees, never above 58 degrees. Fire consumption, 4 to 6 pieces of split wood per day, regardless of outside conditions or number of occupants. The numbers told a story that contradicted everything they had believed about heating and shelter. The women, forced together in unprecedented intimacy, began sharing observations that would prove crucial to future construction. Agnes Kelly noticed how moisture behaved differently in the earth lodge. Walls that should have been damp from breathing and cooking remained dry to the touch. Mary Henderson discovered that food cooked more evenly and stayed warm longer in the consistent air temperature. Mrs. Jorgensen, who had managed households through 20 Minnesota winters, admitted privately that she had never experienced such comfortable January weather indoors. Iron Bull, the Hidatsa elder who had guided Beaumont's original construction, visited the overcrowded lodge in early January. The old man surveyed the scene with satisfaction, but no surprise. His people had weathered countless harsh winters in similar structures, though rarely with 19 occupants. Through Beaumont's translation, he explained to the fascinated audience how Earth Lodge villages had sheltered entire extended families during the worst storms, and how the design principles they were experiencing had been refined over centuries of practical application. The psychological transformation of the shelter's occupants became as significant as their physical survival. Henderson, who had proclaimed log cabins the mark of civilization, now found himself planning modifications to his own homestead that incorporated earth shelter principles. The Morrison boys discussed building a hybrid structure that combined log walls with earthen berming for insulation. Father McKenna, whose theological objections had initially branded the Earth Lodge as heathen architecture, began to see divine providence in indigenous knowledge that preserved life when European methods failed. By late January, as the brutal cold finally began to moderate, the cramped residents had become inadvertent students of thermal dynamics, structural engineering, and sustainable building practices. They had experienced firsthand how thermal mass moderated temperature swings, how proper ventilation prevented both suffocation and heat loss, and how working with natural materials and landforms could create shelter more effective than anything their previous experience had taught them. The Earth Lodge had saved their lives, but more than that, it had educated them in possibilities they had never imagined. Spring brought more than melting snow to the settlement at Bent Creek. It brought a revolution in how frontier families thought about shelter and survival. As the survivors emerged from their winter ordeal in the Earth Lodge, they carried with them detailed knowledge of construction methods that had saved their lives when conventional wisdom had nearly killed them. Henderson wasted no time implementing what he had learned, beginning construction of a modified Earth Lodge before the ground fully thawed. His design represented the first hybrid approach to the problem of prairie shelter. Rather than abandon log construction entirely, Henderson built a traditional rectangular cabin but sunk it 3 feet into the ground and bermed earth against all 4 walls. He copied Beaumont's central fireplace design, positioning the hearth in the middle of the single room rather than against an exterior wall. Most crucially, he doubled the wall thickness by building an inner log wall, an outer log wall, and filling the 18-inch gap between them with packed earth and prairie grass, a technique that combined familiar materials with the thermal mass principles he had observed in the Earth Lodge. The Morrison boys took a different approach, constructing what became known locally as a sod castle. They built stone foundations in a circular pattern, then stacked prairie sod like masonry blocks, creating walls 4 feet thick at the base and tapering to 2 feet at the roofline. The structure rose only 8 feet above ground level, but its mass proved almost as effective as full earth shelter construction. Pete Morrison, his frostbitten toes a permanent reminder of conventional methods' failures, became an evangelist for thick wall construction among arriving settlers. Word of the Bent Creek winter spread along the trading routes with the efficiency that survival information commanded on the frontier. Trappers carried tales of the buried house that had saved 19 lives, and their stories grew more detailed with each telling as practical men demanded specifics about construction methods. By summer, delegations arrived from settlements along the Platte and Arkansas rivers, seeking first-hand instruction in earth shelter techniques. Beaumont found himself an unlikely teacher, demonstrating construction methods to groups of skeptical but desperate settlers who had endured their own brutal winters in conventional cabins. He showed them how to read soil conditions, select proper drainage, and calculate the load-bearing requirements for earth-covered roofs. Most importantly, he explained the thermal principles that made the system work, how Earth's thermal mass absorbed heat during warm periods and released it slowly during cold snaps, creating temperature stability that required minimal fuel input. Iron Bull proved equally valuable as an instructor, bringing other Hidatsa builders to share techniques refined over centuries of prairie construction. They demonstrated advanced methods for waterproofing earth roofs, creating cache pits for food storage, and designing ventilation systems that prevented both suffocation and heat loss. The cultural exchange benefited both communities as white settlers gained survival skills while native builders acquired metal tools and materials that improved their own construction capabilities. The hybrid techniques developed at Bent Creek spread across the Great Plains with remarkable speed. The Kelly family relocated to Nebraska Territory and built what they called a Nebraska Palace, a sod structure partially excavated into a hillside with thick walls that maintained comfortable temperatures year-round. Father McKenna carried detailed drawings to other mission settlements, promoting earth shelter methods as both practical and morally sound alternatives to wasteful heating practices. Professional builders began incorporating earth shelter principles into more conventional structures. The technique of berming earth against log cabin walls became standard practice in exposed locations. Central fireplace design, once considered primitive, gained acceptance as builders recognized its superior heating efficiency. Double wall construction with earth-fill insulation appeared in homesteader cabins from Kansas to Montana, testimony to the practical wisdom learned during that brutal winter. The railroad's arrival in the 1860s brought cheaper lumber and coal, temporarily reducing interest in earth shelter methods among settlers who could afford conventional materials. But economic reality kept the techniques alive among homesteaders, sheep herders, and others who lived on tight margins. The practical knowledge of thermal mass construction persisted in families who had experienced its life-saving benefits, passed down through generations as valuable survival information. Documentation of the methods appeared in farmers' almanacs and homesteading guides throughout the late 19th century. The Prairie Farmer published detailed instructions for earth lodge construction in 1872, crediting the technique with saving countless lives during harsh winters. Government land office publications recommended earth shelter methods for settlers in exposed locations, acknowledging what had once been dismissed as primitive architecture. The Dust Bowl years of the 1930s brought renewed interest in earth shelter construction as families sought alternatives to conventional housing that had failed them during environmental crisis. Children and grandchildren of the Bent Creek survivors found themselves teaching techniques their ancestors had learned from Hidatsa builders, demonstrating how indigenous knowledge had been preserved through family traditions, even as mainstream building practices ignored its lessons. Modern earth-sheltered construction, which gained popularity during the energy crises of the 1970s, drew directly on principles demonstrated at Bent Creek over a century earlier. Contemporary builders rediscovered the thermal advantages of earth-covered roofs, the structural benefits of dome-shaped construction, and the energy efficiency of central heating systems, innovations that frontier families had adopted out of necessity when their lives depended on getting the details right. The vindication of Beaumont's methods proved complete. though it took decades to achieve full recognition. What had been mocked as the work of a prairie mole became acknowledged as sophisticated environmental design that worked with natural systems rather than against them. The Earth Lodge that saved 19 lives during the winter of 1843 established principles that would influence sustainable building practices into the 21st century, demonstrating that survival wisdom often lies not in the latest innovations, but in the accumulated knowledge of people who had learned to live successfully in harsh places through centuries of practical experience.